Settle in, gently, and let the world outside your room grow distant for a while. Let your shoulders loosen. Let your jaw unclench. Let your breathing become slow and even, like waves that arrive and retreat without hurry. Tonight we begin at the beginning of Voldemort's story, not with the name people feared, but with the life that formed it, piece by piece, choice by choice, until a boy became something colder than a man. Long before anyone whispered the title Dark Lord, there was a family called the Gaunts. Their name carried an old, poisonous pride. They were the kind of people who spoke about blood as if it were a crown, as if ancestry alone could make them noble, even when their lives were ruined and their hearts were cruel. They lived on the edge of a Muggle village, in a house that sagged with neglect, half shack and half tomb, the air inside it thick with anger and decay. The Gaunts believed they were special because they were descended from Salazar Slytherin, one of Hogwarts' founders. And in a twisted way, they were right. The line was real. But the inheritance they clung to wasn't only heritage. It was bitterness. It was violence passed down like an heirloom. It was the habit of turning fear into control. In that broken home lived Marvolo Gaunt, proud and unstable, and his son Morfin, who was fierce, unpredictable, and delighted by cruelty. And there was also Merope Gaunt, their daughter and sister, a quiet, frightened witch, who had been taught by her own family that she mattered least. Merope did not grow up with warmth. She grew up with shouting, with humiliation, with the sharp certainty that kindness was not something you could expect. If there was tenderness in her, it had nowhere to go. If there was hope, it had been stepped on until it barely breathed. Across the way, in the nearby village, lived the Riddles, a wealthy Muggle family with a large house and polished windows, and the sort of comfort that seemed impossible to someone like Merope. Merope watched them from a distance, and her attention settled on Tom Riddle Sr., a handsome young man who rode through the village with the ease of someone who had never been afraid of his own life. To Merope, he became more than a person. He became a symbol of escape, of romance, of a world where the walls didn't close in. She wanted out. She wanted to be chosen. She wanted to be safe. When circumstances shifted, and Marvolo and Morfin were removed from the picture for a time, Merope finally had space to act. But the tragedy of Merope's life was that she did not know how to build love with honesty. Her understanding of power had been shaped by the Gaunts, by the idea that you take what you want, that you force the world to give you what it won't offer freely. So she reached for the easiest, darkest shortcut. She used magic to bind Tom Riddle Sr. to her, an enchantment that mimicked devotion. It looked, from the outside, like a sudden romance, like an unlikely love story, like a Muggle man swept off his feet by an awkward village girl. For a while, Merope lived in a dream she had stitched together with spellwork. She left the Gaunt house behind. She wore better clothes. She walked through daylight without flinching. She belonged, at least on the surface, to the kind of life she had stared at from afar, and perhaps, in those early days, she tried to convince herself that it was real. Perhaps she told herself that he would have loved her anyway, if only he had seen her properly, if only the world had been fair. But magic that forces affection is not affection. It is control. It is theft. It cannot hold forever. Eventually, Tom Riddle Sr. broke free, whether because the enchantment weakened, or because she stopped maintaining it, or because reality simply pushed back as reality often does. When he realized what had happened, the horror in him was immediate. He fled, leaving Nairobi behind, pregnant and alone, with the dream collapsing around her like paper in rain. And when the dream collapsed, she had nowhere solid to stand. The wizarding world had never been kind to her. Her family was cruelty. The Muggle world would never understand her. She had traded everything on an illusion, and now, She was left with the consequences and the silence. Merope drifted to London, to a Muggle orphanage, worn down in body and spirit. Whatever strength her magic could have offered her seemed distant, as if despair had muffled it. She had one last thing to give. A child. In a bare room, in pain and exhaustion, she gave birth. She named her baby Tom Marvolo Riddle, Tom, after the man who had abandoned her, Marvolo after the father who had tormented her. It was as though even in naming her son, Merope could not free herself from the forces that had shaped her. And then, with the last breath of her ruined hope, she died. So Tom Riddle began life without a mother's arms, without a father's voice, without a home that felt like home. The orphanage raised him in the way institutions raise children, with food and schedules, with rules and beds lined up in rows, with a kind of distant care that kept you alive but did not tell you that you were cherished. For some children, the lack of love becomes a wound that makes them tender. For Tom Riddle, it became a lesson. He learned early that the world did not naturally give comfort. He learned to take. He learned to watch adults and discover what they wanted to believe. He learned to wear the right expression at the right moment. And he learned, with a quiet, chilling thrill, that he could make things happen around him. Even as a small boy, strange incidents followed him. Objects moved when he wanted them to. Animals reacted to him. Other children were frightened of him. Not always because they understood why, but because they sensed his attention like a hand closing around their throat. He could hurt them without leaving the kinds of marks that got punished in ordinary ways. He could make them feel powerless, and he enjoyed that feeling in himself, the feeling that he could decide what happened next. Tom also collected little trophies, stolen things from other children, not for need, but for ownership. He wanted proof that he could enter someone else's world and remove something from it without permission. Each stolen object was a small victory against the helplessness he refused to feel. Adults at the orphanage noticed that he was clever, controlled, and unsettling. But unsettling is a vague word, and vague words do not stop anyone. They scolded him. They watched him. They sometimes feared him in private, but they could not truly reach him. They could not soften him. And Tom did not want to be softened. By the time he was 11, Tom's mind already held certain beliefs like stones. That affection is unreliable, that people are weak, that fear is useful, that power is safety. He had no reason to doubt these beliefs because they had protected him. They had kept him above the other children, above the chaos, above the pain of wanting something he could not have. Then, one day, a man arrived to speak with him, a professor from a hidden school, a place Tom had never heard of, a world that had existed beside his own without his knowledge. The professor explained, calmly and carefully, that Tom was a wizard, that the strange things around him were not accidents, that there was a school called Hogwarts where he could learn to control his abilities. For many children, such a revelation would feel like rescue, like belonging, like a door opening into wonder. For Tom Riddle, it felt like confirmation of something he had always suspected, that he was different, that he was meant for more. But it also awakened fury, because if there had been a world where he belonged, then why had he been left in the orphanage? Why had no one come sooner? Why had he been forced to struggle among people who could not understand him? Tom's excitement was sharp, not soft. Suspicious, not trusting. He demanded proof. He needed to see power with his own eyes before he allowed himself to believe. And when he saw it, when the professor demonstrated magic, when the impossible became real, Tom's hunger took shape. He wanted to learn everything. He wanted to master this new world like someone determined to win a war. And deep down, beneath all the intelligence and composure, something else stirred. relief that he was not ordinary, and contempt for the ordinary life he had been forced to endure. Tom went to Diagon Alley, entered a shop full of wands, and chose a wand that felt, in his hand, like an answer. The wand was not simply a tool. It was a promise. It meant he would never again be trapped in helplessness. He bought books. He bought robes. He stepped into the wizarding world with the cold certainty of someone who had found his rightful arena. And then he boarded the train to Hogwarts. The castle rose from the landscape like a dream made of stone. Ancient towers, high windows, deep corridors. The air itself seemed layered with history, with whispers, with magic that had soaked into the walls over centuries. For most first years, Hogwarts inspires awe. For Tom, it inspired calculation. And calculation together. Braided tightly, he was not only impressed, he was alert. He understood instinctively that a place this old would have secrets, and he wanted them. At the sorting ceremony, the hat placed him where his nature aligned most cleanly, Slytherin House. The house that admired ambition. The house that valued cunning. The house that carried the echo of Salazar Slytherin's legend. Tom fit there smoothly, like a blade sliding into a sheath, and once sorted, he began his work. From the very beginning, Tom performed excellence. He learned quickly. He answered neatly. He excelled in practical magic and theory alike. Teachers praised him. Students noticed him. He carried himself with a controlled confidence that made others assume maturity, and Tom used that attention the way he used everything, as leverage. Praise made people lower their guard. Admiration made them forgive oddness. Charm made them overlook the chill behind his politeness. But Tom was not at Hogwarts merely to be a brilliant student. He was there to solve the riddle of himself. He knew his name was Tom Riddle, and he hated it, not at first because of what it would become, but because it tied him to a father who had never come back, a father who had left him to grow up in a place where no one chose him. He began investigating his origins with the patience of someone peeling back skin. He asked questions carefully. He read records. He listened to how pure-blood students spoke of ancestry and lineage. Slowly he discovered what had been hidden, that his mother was not a muggle at all, but a witch, Merape Gaunt, and that her family line was old, tied to Salazar Slytherin himself. This knowledge should have been complicated. It should have brought grief for the mother he never knew, shame for the violence of the Gaunts, confusion about what love and coercion had done to create him. But Tom did not process it like that. He processed it like a king discovering a claim to a throne. If he was descended from Slytherin, then the legend belonged to him. He could wrap himself in that ancestry like a cloak. It did not matter that the Gaunts were poor and broken. What mattered was the line, the connection, the authority it could suggest. And then there was the snake language, Parseltongue, the ability to speak to serpents. Tom discovered it wasn't something he had to learn. It flowed from him as naturally as speech. He could stand near a snake and speak to it, and it would understand him. The first time he realized it, he did not feel fear. He felt confirmation, like a lock clicking open, like proof that he was what he had begun to believe he was, special, chosen, destined. As Tom grew older, he began to cultivate followers, not openly at first, not as a commander with a banner, but as a talented, magnetic student who could make others feel important when he looked at them. He noticed which students had sharpness in them, which ones had cruelty, which ones liked the idea of being part of something elite. He offered them his attention. He offered them the feeling of being selected, and he watched how quickly people will trade their morals for belonging. In lessons, Tom explored magic with a kind of hunger that never seemed satisfied. He was fascinated by the boundaries of spells, by how far you could push the rules before they broke. He studied forbidden subjects with an obsessive care, searching for knowledge that felt hidden on purpose. He did not want magic that simply created light or repaired objects. He wanted magic that changed the shape of existence, magic that could control, magic that could end, magic that could keep him safe forever. It is important to understand this. Tom's greatest fear was not losing a duel. It was being powerless. It was being reduced again to a child in an orphanage bed, unwanted and unseen. That fear hardened into a hatred of vulnerability itself. And because death is the final vulnerability, the ultimate loss of control, Tom began to fear death with a deep, furious intensity. He started asking questions in careful ways, not how do you become immortal, because that would alarm people, but questions that danced around the edge of the truth. Is it possible to survive death? Has anyone ever done it? What magic protects the soul? He wanted certainty, not comfort. He wanted a mechanism, a method, a way to engineer his own permanence. During these years, Hogwarts carried another secret, one older than Tom, older than the teachers who praised him, a secret tied directly to the founder whose blood Tom had inherited, the legend of the Chamber of Secrets. The story that Slytherin had built a hidden chamber beneath the school, and that his true heir would one day open it and release a monster to purge the school of those Slytherin considered unworthy. For most students, it was just a story told with a thrill. For Tom Riddle, it felt like a challenge and a promise, a secret door that belonged to him. In his 5th year, Tom acted. He found the entrance. He opened the chamber. He released what was inside, not as a careless accident, but as a deliberate test. The monster moved through the school like a nightmare with scales. Students were attacked and left petrified, frozen in terror and magic. Fear spread. Teachers searched. The castle felt colder. Whispers turned into panic. And through it all, Tom Riddle remained outwardly calm, outwardly concerned, outwardly helpful. This was one of his early masterpieces. He created danger, then watched how easily people wanted to believe he was innocent. He used fear like a fog, making it hard for anyone to see clearly. He understood that if he controlled the story, he could control the outcome. A student died during that time. A death that made the threat real in the worst possible way. Hogwarts considered closing. Adults panicked. The weight of consequences pressed closer. Tom needed a way to end the chaos without exposing himself. So he chose a scapegoat. He framed another student, someone already viewed as strange and suspicious by those who wanted simple answers. A half-giant boy who loved dangerous creatures, who had a reputation for accidents, who stood out in a school full of ordinary children. Tom turned prejudice into a weapon. He arranged the evidence. He guided suspicion. He watched as adults chose the easiest conclusion, because the easiest conclusion was comforting. The monster wasn't part of a deep secret. It was just the fault of a clumsy boy with a liking for beasts. The chamber was closed. The crisis ended. The scapegoat was punished. And Tom Riddle walked away untouched, his reputation polished brighter by the illusion that he had helped solve the problem. He was rewarded with approval, with admiration, with a sense that he could bend reality and still be celebrated for it. This success did something dangerous to him. It proved that he could commit evil and be praised. It proved that rules were not walls, they were curtains, and he could step behind them whenever he wanted. As he approached his final years at Hogwarts, Tom continued to refine himself. His mask became smoother. His charm became sharper. His control over his own expression became near perfect. People thought they knew him because he let them see the version of him that was useful. He was the brilliant student, the polite young man, the one teachers trusted. But in private, Tom's mind was busy building something else, a future self. He began to hate his birth name more fiercely. Tom sounded ordinary. Riddle sounded like a joke. It reminded him of a father who had run away, of a childhood he considered humiliating. He did not want to be linked to abandonment. He wanted to be the one who abandoned others, the one who left people trembling behind him. So he took his name apart, rearranged it like a spell, and forged a new identity from the pieces. He crafted a title that sounded like power, like inevitability, like a storm approaching. And he practiced wearing that identity in his mind long before he ever spoke it aloud. He also began collecting things, not only trophies stolen from children now, but objects tied to history, objects that made him feel connected to greatness. He was drawn to relics with stories. He liked the idea of owning pieces of the past. It wasn't just greed. It was symbolism. If he possessed the artifacts of legends, then he could position himself as the heir of legends. By the time Tom Riddle graduated, he did not leave Hogwarts as a normal young wizard stepping into adult life. He left like someone leaving a laboratory, satisfied with experiments, eager for larger tests. He had already begun shaping others around him. He had already practiced deception on a grand scale. He had already tasted what it felt like to play with life and death and walk away smiling. And deep inside him, the fear of death had already become an obsession, the kind that would not fade with age but intensify. It would become the engine of everything he did next. Because Tom Riddle did not want to be merely powerful, he wanted to be permanent. He wanted to be unavoidable. He wanted the world to learn, slowly and painfully, that it could not get rid of him. Breathe slowly, and let the edges of the day soften. Let the room around you stay quiet and safe while the story moves forward, unhurried. We left Tom Riddle at the moment he stepped out of Hogwarts, not as a boy looking for a place in the world, but as someone already deciding how the world should bend around him. When Tom graduated, he did not rush into loud fame. That wasn't his style. He understood something most people never fully grasp, that real power grows best when it grows quietly at first, in places where it doesn't look like power yet. He didn't want to be noticed by the whole world. Not immediately. He wanted access. He wanted secrets. He wanted to build a foundation so deep that, when he finally rose, it would feel less like a person standing up and more like a shadow filling a room. So he chose his first path carefully. He took work at a shop that dealt in old, curious things, artifacts that had belonged to wizards long dead, objects touched by history, sometimes by tragedy. It was the kind of place where people brought what they'd hidden in attics, what they'd stolen from estates, what they didn't fully understand but couldn't bear to throw away. A place where the dusty past passed from hand to hand. A place where rare and powerful items might appear, briefly, before disappearing again. To Tom, that job wasn't ordinary employment. It was a hunting ground. He was charming with customers in a smooth, controlled way that made them feel listened to. He was polite, even flattering, and people found themselves trusting him without knowing why. He learned the art of asking questions that didn't sound like questions. He learned how to let someone speak until they revealed what they valued, what they feared, what they were willing to trade. He was never in a hurry. If a person was reluctant, he simply waited, confident that patience could wear down almost anything. And in the back of his mind, there was always that hunger for objects that meant something. Not because of money. Money mattered, of course, because money buys time and silence and distance from consequences. But Tom wanted more than wealth. He wanted symbols. He wanted heirlooms. He wanted pieces of legend that he could claim and corrupt, turning history into proof of his dominance. During those years, he also disappeared at times, quietly, without dramatic announcements. People in the shop might notice that he'd requested time away, or that he'd gone on some errand that took longer than expected. But no one questioned him too closely, because he was so useful, so capable, so strangely persuasive. And because, even then, a faint unease hovered around him like cold air. People who felt that unease rarely leaned in. They leaned away. While he worked, Tom continued what he had truly started at Hogwarts, the reshaping of himself. He had already built the mask of the brilliant student. Now he built the mask of the refined young man, the one with impeccable manners, the one who understood old families and old traditions. He carried himself like someone who belonged in ancestral halls and candle-lit rooms. He spoke with quiet confidence. He listened with that careful attention that makes people feel important, even as he measured them like instruments. But beneath the mask, his private life was sharper and darker. He was searching for a way around death. It wasn't only fear that drove him now. It was outrage. Tom did not see death as a natural ending. He saw it as an insult. He believed the world owed him more than a brief lifespan. He believed that if magic existed, real, world-bending magic, then death should be negotiable. And if it wasn't negotiable, then he would break it. In the hidden corners of the wizarding world, there were stories about such things. Whispers of ancient rites, fragments in forbidden books, rumors passed through careful mouths. Tom pursued these rumors the way a wolf follows scent. He tracked down knowledge that ordinary people would never touch, either because they feared it or because it revolted them. Tom was not revolted. He was curious, coldly, intensely curious. At some point in those years, he crossed the line from theory to action. There are many dark spells, but few as terrible as the magic that rips at the soul itself. The soul is meant to be whole. It is meant to be one continuous, living thing. The idea of breaking it, splitting it, cutting pieces away like meat is something most wizards would refuse to imagine. But Tom imagined it with clarity. He understood the principle that if part of you is anchored elsewhere, then you cannot fully die. That if your soul is divided and hidden inside objects, then death becomes complicated, incomplete, delayed. To do this, you need an act that shatters the soul. Murder is not only a crime in the wizarding world, it is a spiritual violence. It tears the murderer as well as the victim. Most people recoil from it because something inside them recognizes that tearing. Tom did not recoil. He simply saw the method. The first murder he committed was not random. It was personal. It was rooted in his hatred of his own origin. He had discovered where his father lived. He had found the house. He had found the life Tom Riddle Sr. had continued to live as if nothing had happened, as if a girl had not died, as if a child had not existed. Tom traveled there with the quiet determination of someone returning to a scene of humiliation to rewrite it. He murdered his father. He murdered his grandparents too, partly to erase witnesses, partly to erase a whole branch of ordinary life that disgusted him. And in doing so, he cut himself free from the shame of being abandoned, not by healing, not by forgiveness, but by violence. He did not want to be the child left behind. He wanted to be the one who left corpses behind. Then he framed someone else for it, as he had done at Hogwarts. He understood scapegoats. He understood prejudice and anger. He knew exactly how to make the world believe the simplest story. And when it was done, he took something from the wreckage, an old ring. This ring mattered to him, because it was not just a ring. It was an inheritance from the Gaunt line, a piece of his better ancestry, tied to the legendary founder whose blood he shared. Tom didn't see the Gaunts as people. He saw them as a vault of symbols. And that ring, in his mind, became a perfect first anchor, a place to hide a fragment of himself. So he performed the dark work and split his soul, and sealed the first piece into the ring. It's difficult to truly describe what that means without making it feel abstract. So imagine it simply, in a gentle, distant way. Imagine a person taking the most delicate part of themselves, the part that would usually travel on after death, and hammering it into an object like a nail driven into wood. Not a harmless nail, something more like a hook, something that catches on the world so it cannot move on. Tom did it, and he did not stop. Once he proved to himself that it was possible, he became relentless. The act was monstrous, and yet it gave him what he craved, the sense that death was no longer an absolute cliff edge. He had stepped onto a ledge beneath it, a ledge no one else knew existed. And because his hunger was never satisfied, he began looking for more anchors, better anchors, ones worthy of the grand identity he was building. He had already grown to hate the name Tom Riddle. Now he sharpened his new name in his mind, polishing it until it felt like a weapon. Voldemort, a name that sounded like something you couldn't bargain with. Like a sound the wind makes before a storm breaks. But he didn't yet shout that name to the world, not yet. In public, he continued as the talented young man at the shop. He continued to flatter old witches and wizards, to appear helpful, to carry antiques in careful hands, to speak warmly of history as if he respected it. The irony was that he did respect it, in his own twisted way. Not because it taught humility, but because it offered him an idea that legends endure, that names endure, that if you could bind your soul to a story, you could stretch yourself across centuries. He began seeking objects that had belonged to Hogwarts founders, because the founders represented permanence. Their names were carved into the school's identity. If Voldemort could tie himself to those relics, it would feel like tying himself to the very roots of wizarding history. He hunted with patience and charm. When he heard of a wealthy woman with a beautiful ancient locket, something tied to an old pure-blood line, he visited her. He spoke gently. He praised her taste. He let her feel admired. And then, when he had what he wanted, he left her in ruin. Whether by force, by coercion, by manipulation, the pattern was always the same. He approached like a friend and departed like a sickness that had taken something vital. That locket became another anchor. He searched for a cup connected to another founder. Something crafted long ago, passed down like a treasured artery of pride. He arranged meetings. He made promises. He looked into people's eyes and let them think they were safe. That cup became another anchor. He did not choose ordinary objects. He chose objects that carried meaning, because he wanted his immortality to feel like dominance over history itself. And still, that wasn't enough. As his soul fractured further, something happened to him, not in a way he would acknowledge, but in a way the world could see if it looked closely. His appearance began to shift. He was still handsome for a time, still composed, still able to charm, but there was a hardening, a thinning, something that made him seem less like a young man and more like a sculpture carved too sharply. People might not have been able to say what was wrong, but they felt it. They felt that something in him had become unnatural. Tom did not care. If anything, he was pleased, because he believed he was leaving ordinary humanity behind. He believed he was evolving into something higher. He did not want to be human in the way other people were human. Soft, fragile, dying. He wanted to be a force. At some point, he began gathering followers more openly, not as classmates at school, but as adults, drawn to his ideology. He found people who feared change, who feared sharing power, who wanted the wizarding world to belong only to certain bloodlines. He offered them a vision that flattered their worst instincts. He offered them a sense of superiority, dressed up as tradition. And he offered them the thrill of being close to power. To those followers, he was not simply Tom Riddle. He was someone who spoke like a leader, someone who seemed to know secrets, someone whose confidence felt contagious. And to people who are insecure, a confident voice can feel like a lifeline. He formed them into a circle, a hidden movement, a growing threat. The more followers he gathered, the more he understood that fear was his strongest tool. He didn't just want people to disagree with him. He wanted them to tremble. He wanted their choices to shrink until the only safe choice was obedience. And he began to test the wizarding world's boundaries. Disappearances happened, murders that were whispered about in corners, families attacked, houses burned. Sometimes the victims were muggle-born witches and wizards, those Voldemort's ideology labeled as unworthy. Sometimes the victims were purebloods who resisted him. Sometimes the victims were simply in the wrong place, useful as a message, because Voldemort's cruelty was not always emotional. It was strategic. Each act of terror was a signal. I can reach you. I can hurt you. I can do it again. And as these signals accumulated, the wizarding world shifted. People started locking doors that had never been locked. People started checking over shoulders. Trust became brittle. Even friendships developed a faint edge, because fear makes people suspicious, and suspicion makes them lonely. Lonely people are easier to control. During this time, Voldemort approached Hogwarts again, not as a student, but as a man with a polite request. He wanted the position of defense against the dark arts teacher. It might sound strange on the surface, but in his mind it was logical. Hogwarts was the heart of the wizarding world. If he could root himself there, if he could influence young minds, if he could place his hands on the school's secrets again, he would strengthen his future. Also, there was something else. He liked the idea of returning to the place that had shaped him, not as a boy under rules, but as a master stepping into a space that had once tried to shape him. He wanted to prove that even Hogwarts could not deny him. He met with the headmaster, Albus Dumbledore, a man who had watched Tom Riddle closely, even when Tom was a student. Dumbledore had never been fooled by the surface charm. He had seen the coldness beneath. He had seen the hunger. And now, as Tom stood before him again, older and altered, Dumbledore's suspicion sharpened. The conversation between them was calm on the surface and dangerous underneath. Voldemort requested the job with politeness, but his politeness felt like a glove stretched over claws. Dumbledore listened, asked questions, watched. Voldemort tried to present himself as someone reformed, someone interested in teaching, someone who had turned his talents toward respectable paths. But Dumbledore did not offer him what he wanted. He refused. And Voldemort left Hogwarts with something burning inside him. Not only anger, but the certainty that Dumbledore would always be an obstacle. Voldemort had many enemies, but Dumbledore was different. Dumbledore was not easily frightened. Dumbledore was not easily deceived. Dumbledore saw what Voldemort was becoming. Voldemort did not forget that. Before he left the castle, Voldemort also did something else, something quiet and sinister. He hid something there, an anchor, another piece of himself. He understood that Hogwarts was protected by powerful magic, and he believed that hiding a Horcrux in the school would be safer than almost anywhere else. It was arrogance, yes, but it was also cunning, because who would suspect that the Dark Lord had tucked part of his soul into the very heart of the place meant to teach and protect children? After that, his rise accelerated. The group around him tightened into something more official, more devoted. They became known in whispers by the name that suggested both loyalty and terror: Death Eaters. The name itself was like a promise. It implied that death was something they consumed, something they served, something they could wield. Voldemort used them like extensions of his will. He commanded, punished, rewarded. He didn't inspire love in them. He inspired obsession and fear. Some followed because they agreed with his ideology. Some followed because they wanted to be on the winning side. Some followed because they were already cruel, and Voldemort gave their cruelty permission to be grand. And Dovedort, at the center, continued his own transformation. His body began to reflect the tearing he had done to his soul. His features became sharper, less human. His eyes grew colder, almost unnervingly focused. His skin seemed paler. His presence, even without him speaking, had a weight that pressed on the room. People who met him often remembered one feeling more than anything else, that he did not regard them as equals. He regarded them as tools or obstacles or prey. And with every year, the wizarding world grew more afraid. The ministry struggled to respond effectively. Some officials denied the threat because denial is easier than admitting you're losing control. Some tried to negotiate with shadows. Some were too afraid to act, because acting would paint targets on their backs. Meanwhile, ordinary people suffered. Families vanished. Children grew up hearing whispers that made bedtime feel unsafe. The world that had once felt stable began to feel like it was cracking. Voldemort thrived in that crack. He did not simply want to win political power. He wanted to reshape the entire society into something that worshipped strength and feared weakness. He wanted to rewrite the rules so that his cruelty was not a crime but a law. He wanted a world where he was not merely a criminal on the run, but a ruler everyone had to acknowledge. And he kept splitting his soul. If you step back and look at the pattern, it's almost horrifying in its calm repetition. Voldemort would choose a meaningful object. He would commit murder. He would perform the ritual. He would seal another fragment. He would move on. Each time, he grew harder to destroy, and each time, he grew less human. But here is the quiet truth beneath all of it. He was not becoming invincible because he was wise. He was becoming invincible because he was afraid. All that violence, all that tearing, all that obsession, it was driven by terror of an ending. He was a man building an enormous fortress, but he was building it around a fear that never left him. By the time the wizarding world fully realized how deep the danger ran, Voldemort was no longer a rumor. He was a presence, a shadow that had learned to speak, and people began to say his name less and less, because even saying it felt risky. They started calling him you-know-who, as if words themselves could summon him. The First War had begun, not with one clear declaration, but with the slow accumulation of fear turning into open conflict. Those who resisted Voldemort gathered around Dumbledore, because Dumbledore's courage made others brave. The Order of the Phoenix formed, a group of witches and wizards determined to fight back even when it was dangerous, even when it was exhausting, even when it cost lives. And Voldemort watched this resistance with cold attention. He did not panic at opposition. He studied it. He searched for fractures. He searched for weak points. He understood that not everyone could stand against fear forever, so he tried to break the world's morale piece by piece. Not only by killing, but by making people doubt each other, by turning friends into suspects, by forcing betrayals. He understood the simplest cruelty, that if you can make people trust nothing, you can make them obey anything. As the war darkened, Voldemort's attention narrowed toward a particular kind of target. Not only Muggle-borns, not only political enemies, but anyone who posed a real threat to his future. And in his mind, the greatest threat was always the same: someone who could destroy him. He knew Dumbledore was powerful. He knew Dumbledore was clever. He knew Dumbledore suspected the truth of his dark magic. Voldemort did not like uncertainty. He did not like opponents he could not easily intimidate. So Voldemort began looking for a way to remove destiny itself from the equation. And that is where prophecy entered the story like a whisper in a corridor, like a candle suddenly going out. Voldemort, hungry for certainty, learned that there was a prophecy, a prediction that spoke about him and about a child with the power to bring about his downfall. Voldemort's obsession with avoiding death turned immediately into obsession with preventing this future. He could not tolerate the idea that something outside his control might be shaping his end. So he acted as he always acted. He sought to destroy the threat before it could become real. The child named in the prophecy was not yet a person Voldemort could truly see. Just a baby, a possibility. But Voldemort did not hesitate at possibilities. He struck at them like they were already weapons. His choice led him toward a small family in hiding, a couple who had fought against him, a baby born into a world already poisoned by fear. And Voldemort decided to kill the child, not because he was angry, not because he needed to prove cruelty, but because, in his mind, killing the baby was simply good strategy. Eliminate the variable. Remove the risk. Make the future quiet. He didn't understand then that in trying to prevent prophecy, he was walking straight into it. It began, as so many disasters do, with a fragment of information. A prophecy had been spoken, half heard, and carried away like a spark in the dark. Voldemort was the sort of person who could not tolerate sparks. He believed uncertainty was a weakness, and he despised weakness. Even when he didn't know the full words, even when he only knew the shape of the warning, it was enough to burrow into his mind and make him restless. A child, a threat, a future that might not belong to him. To most people, prophecy is unsettling but vague. To Voldemort, it was a challenge, a dare, and his response to a dare was always the same: crush it. So he searched for the child. He learned that the prophecy pointed toward a baby born at the end of July, to parents who had defied him. And because Voldemort's thinking was always coldly practical, he did not pause to ask whether a child could truly threaten him. He did not pause to ask whether fate was something you could fight by force. He only saw a risk, and he treated it like an enemy. There were two possible children who fit the outline, but Voldemort, with his obsession with blood and lineage, made his choice. He leaned toward the baby who, to him, seemed most significant, most likely to fit the shape of the prophecy as he imagined it. Not because he understood destiny, but because he trusted his own prejudice more than anything else. And once he chose, he moved quickly. At that time, the wizarding world was already exhausted. People were hiding. People were fleeing. People were praying that tomorrow would be normal, and waking up to find the news worse. There were safe houses, secret messages, coded meetings. There were brave people fighting back and frightened people keeping their heads down, and far too many caught in the middle. Voldemort's name was spoken like a curse, if it was spoken at all. The family he targeted had gone into hiding, with help from friends. They trusted in protective magic, in secrecy, in the idea that if they could stay out of sight long enough, the storm might pass. They were young, and they were tired. And they were trying to protect their child with everything they had. But Voldemort was patient when patience served him, and ruthless when it didn't. Somewhere in the chain of resistance, something broke. A secret was betrayed. A location was given up. The details of how that betrayal happened are tangled with fear and regret, and the particular tragedy of a war where people are pushed past their limits. What matters in the shape of this story is that Voldemort was handed what he wanted, a doorway into their hiding place. He went there himself. He didn't send a follower. He didn't delegate. He wanted to be the one to end the threat with his own hand, because he trusted no one else to do it properly, and because he believed the act would seal his victory over fate. It was a small house, a simple place, by magical standards, not a fortress, not a castle, not a monument to old bloodlines, just a home. And on that night, the air around it carried the quiet hush of late autumn, the kind of hush that feels harmless until you realize it's the pause before something shatters. Voldemort arrived like a blade sliding out of darkness. Inside, the parents had only moments to understand what was happening. One of them tried to buy time, not because time was truly enough, but because love makes people do impossible things, even when the odds are hopeless. There was no grand duel that lasted for ages. Voldemort, at full strength, was terrifyingly efficient. The first life he took that night was taken swiftly, as though it barely registered to him as anything other than a step. Then he moved deeper into the house. Upstairs was the baby. The mother stood between Voldemort and the child. She didn't have a wand in her hand, not in the way a duelist would. She wasn't thinking about victory. She wasn't thinking about strategy. She was thinking about one thing, and one thing only. Keep him away. Voldemort told her to move. To Voldemort, this would have seemed almost polite, a chance for her to step aside, a chance for her to live. He didn't understand that to her, living wasn't the point if it meant the baby died. He didn't understand that there are people who do not measure life by how long it lasts, but by what it protects. She refused. She begged him, not for herself, but for her child. And Voldemort, who had built his entire identity around never begging, never yielding, never being vulnerable, found the moment irritating. He had no patience for pleas. He had no respect for sacrifice. He believed fear was the strongest emotion in the world, and he believed love was sentimental weakness. So he killed her, too. And here is the hinge of the story, the turning point, the quiet, extraordinary moment Voldemort never predicted. The mother's refusal was not just brave. It was magical in a way. Voldemort could not replicate because it was not rooted in a spell he had learned from a book. It was rooted in a choice, a pure, deliberate decision to die so someone else could live. That kind of choice leaves a mark on the world. It creates a protection that is older than cleverness, older than cruelty. It is not flashy magic. It does not look like lightning. It looks like a simple truth made solid. You cannot harm what has been shielded by that sacrifice, not in the way you intended. Voldemort lifted his wand towards the baby and cast the killing curse, expecting the easiest act of his night. Instead, the curse met something it couldn't pass through. It rebounded. The force of it snapped back on Voldemort like a trap slamming shut, and the body he had shaped and sharpened, the body he thought was proof of his victory over death, was destroyed in an instant. For a moment, he did not die in the way ordinary people die, because he had already torn his soul apart. He had created anchors. He had made himself unnatural, so he did not pass on. He did not fade away. What remained of him was a wrecked, broken thing. Not a person as the world usually understands a person, but a fragment of will clinging to existence, thinner than smoke and colder than air. He fled. He escaped the ruined house as something barely alive, barely there, and in doing so, he became, for a time, a ghost story. The wizarding world woke to the news like someone waking from a nightmare, and not immediately trusting the silence. Voldemort had fallen. The Dark Lord was gone. His followers scattered. Some tried to pretend they had never served him. Some were caught. Some vanished. Some clung to the idea that he would return, because fear has a long memory. And in the middle of it all was a baby, who had somehow survived the most lethal curse in the wizarding world. A scar remained on the child's forehead, not just a wound, but a trace of what had happened. A mark shaped like a jagged line, as if lightning had touched him and decided to stay. People would later call it a symbol, an omen, a sign. But for the child, it was simply a scar, something he would carry without understanding, long before he could understand stories or prophecies or war. The survivors began to talk. At first it was disbelief, then it was wonder. Then it became myth. They called the child the one who lived, because it was easier to turn shock into a title than to sit with the raw truth that their world had been saved not by superior power, but by a mother standing in a doorway and refusing to step aside. Meanwhile, Voldemort, or what was left of him, drifted through the world like a curse with no mouth. He could not take a normal form. He could not simply walk into a town and begin again. His body was gone, and his soul was too fractured to rebuild itself easily. He had ensured he could avoid full death, but he had not ensured he could live well. His version of immortality was not comfort. It was hunger without satisfaction. It was survival without wholeness. For a long time, he existed in hiding. He moved through forests and ruins and lonely places, avoiding the watchful eyes of wizards who might sense something wrong. He was too weak to risk attention, too weak to duel, too weak to control followers the way he once had. He became, for a while, exactly what he despised: powerless. But he did not become humble. Instead, his hatred sharpened into something even colder. Because to Voldemort, the worst humiliation wasn't defeat alone. It was defeat by something he considered inferior: a baby. A mother's love. An ancient protection he had dismissed as childish. He could not accept it. In the quiet years after his fall, the wizarding world tried to rebuild. People married. People mourned. People repaired homes, repaired trust, repaired the thin fabric of daily life. The ministry declared the threat ended, because governments like endings. They like to put a full stop on terror and file it away as over. But the people who truly understood Voldemort, those who had watched him, studied him, felt his presence, did not relax completely. Chief among them was Dumbledore, who did not believe Voldemort was the sort of evil that simply vanished. Dumbledore's suspicion had shape and substance now. He knew Voldemort had pursued unnatural magic. He knew Voldemort was obsessed with immortality. He knew that what happened that night didn't feel like a clean death. It felt like a disappearance. So Dumbledore watched and waited and began quietly searching for the truth behind Voldemort's survival. But Voldemort was also searching. He needed a body, a way back into the world. And because he was too weak to do it alone, he needed help. Not help in the friendly sense. Help in the sense of a tool, willing to be used. Over time, he found a kind of refuge far from where people were looking, remote places where the air was harsh and the land felt indifferent. Legends say he traveled beyond Britain, slipping into the corners of Europe where old magic and old fear still lingered. In such places, he could hide his presence inside the noise of wilderness, like a whisper hidden under the roar of wind. And then eventually, someone came close enough for him to reach. Not a hero, not a powerful wizard. A timid, hungry person, someone who wanted importance and was easy to manipulate. Voldemort attached himself to this person like a parasite, living through them, riding their senses, stealing their strength. The host did not understand the full horror of what he carried. He only understood that he was suddenly important to something powerful, and importance can be intoxicating even when it is poisonous. This was how Voldemort survived the years: by clinging, by feeding, by waiting. The wizarding world, meanwhile, raised the boy who lived into a symbol without his consent. People spoke the child's name with reverence and curiosity. They told stories about him as if he were a legend, not a person. They held their relief so tightly they almost crushed it into superstition. If the boy lived, then maybe the darkness truly was gone. And because the world needed the boy to be safe, decisions were made for him. Dumbledore believed that the protection created by the mother's sacrifice had a particular strength. It could be extended through blood, through family ties. If the boy lived with his mother's blood relatives, the old protection could be reinforced, anchored in something simple and steady. It was not a perfect solution. It was not a warm solution. But Dumbledore believed it was the safest option, while Voldemort's shadow still lingered. So the child was placed in a home that was not magical, not loving in the way the wizarding world imagined love. He grew up in ordinary suburbia, in a house that did not celebrate him, in a family that did not understand him. He grew up with confusion instead of praise, with small humiliations instead of heroic songs. And, in a strange way, that too was part of Voldemort's story, because Voldemort had accidentally created the one kind of enemy he could never fully predict, someone who had known loneliness, who had not been shaped into a proud, pampered prince of prophecy. The boy grew up without knowing why. Lightning sometimes seemed to flicker at the edge of his life. Without knowing why, strange things happened when he was frightened or angry or desperate. Without knowing that his name meant something to a whole hidden world. He grew up, and the world waited. And Voldemort waited too, in a different kind of darkness. As the years passed, some of Voldemort's followers tried to move on. Many of them claimed they had been bewitched, coerced, forced. Some of those claims were true in a twisted way. Fear can coerce people more effectively than chains. But others were lies spoken smoothly to avoid punishment. The wizarding courts struggled to separate truth from convenience, because the war had left everyone exhausted, and exhaustion makes people want to believe the simplest story. A handful of Voldemort's most devoted supporters did not accept his loss. They searched for him. They listened for signs. They told themselves that a wizard like Voldemort could not truly be gone. They thought of him like a storm that had only moved beyond the horizon. One of them, in particular, carried a quiet certainty that Voldemort would return, and built his entire identity around preparing for that return. This person waited like a locked door, waiting for the right key, convinced that when the Dark Lord came back, loyalty would be rewarded. Voldemort did not love these loyalists. He did not feel gratitude, but he did understand utility. He understood that fanatic devotion could be used, and used again. In the meantime, Voldemort's own inner state continued to degrade. Splitting the soul does not create strength in the way Voldemort believed. It creates survival, yes, a stubborn refusal to end, but it also creates instability. It creates a kind of thinness, as if the person is stretched across too many places at once. Voldemort, without realizing it, had built an immortality that required constant maintenance, constant control, constant feeding. And when his body was destroyed, his broken form became dependent in a way he hated. He could not bear the idea that he needed anything. Yet he needed hosts. He needed protection. He needed secrecy. And those needs made him angrier. The anger fed his obsession. He began to plan a return that would not simply restore him, but would correct the humiliation of his fall. He wanted to come back not as a shadow, but as something even more frightening than before. He wanted the world to regret the brief moment it had dared to hope. And slowly, through whispered influence, through fragile alliances, through the careful steering of weak-minded helpers, He began to pull threads together. He set his sights on Hogwarts again, because Hogwarts was always the heart of the wizarding world. If he could enter the school, he could reach the children of important families. He could corrupt, recruit, threaten. He could search for old magic. He could control the future. But he still needed a body. His first attempts at building power again were small and cautious. He could not risk open action. His presence had to remain a rumor. So he leaned into the quiet methods that had always served him: manipulation, secrecy, and the slow twisting of other people's choices. He made his host travel. He made his host listen for gossip. He made his host search for objects and information. He aimed toward a particular magical artifact that, according to legend, could restore a person's strength and extend life. The Philosopher's Stone. To Voldemort, the stone was not just a path back. It was an insult he could steal from death itself, a way to rebuild without admitting weakness, a way to return with a kind of elegance, as if his fall had been only a temporary inconvenience. So the hunt began. That year, the boy who lived finally stepped into the wizarding world. He discovered that he was a wizard. He discovered he had been famous without knowing. He discovered Hogwarts, with its moving staircases and shifting portraits and candle-lit halls. He stepped into that castle not as a chosen warrior, but as an overwhelmed child seeing wonder for the first time. And somewhere in that same castle, hidden behind another face, hidden behind a nervous stutter and a borrowed body, Voldemort was closer than anyone realized. In the beginning, it didn't look like a war returning. It looked like odd events, strange warnings, small moments that felt off. A guarded door, a forbidden corridor, a sense that certain teachers were watching too closely, a sense that something in the air of the school was tense, like a storm building far away. The boy, curious and brave in the way young people can be brave without fully knowing the cost, began to pull at those mysteries, not because he wanted a fight, because mysteries at Hogwarts are like threads on a sweater. Once you see them, it's hard not to tug. Voldemort watched him. At first, he may have felt only irritation. The boy was supposed to have been a problem that ended years ago, yet there he was, alive, growing, walking the halls of the school Voldemort had always considered partly his. But irritation soon sharpened into something else. Interest. Because Voldemort, even then, could sense something. A connection. A strange echo when he was near the boy. He did not understand it fully. He only knew that the boy's existence felt like a wound that hadn't healed. The hunt for the Philosopher's Stone drew everything toward confrontation. Voldemort and his host tried to navigate Hogwarts' protections, tried to get past the magical obstacles placed around the stone. Dumbledore, wary and watchful, had arranged layers of defense, trusting that if someone tried to steal it, they would be slowed down long enough for intervention. But Voldemort did not intend to be slowed. He intended to return. The boy and his friends, stumbling into danger with the clumsy courage of youth, pushed through those defenses too, trying to reach the stone first, trying to stop the theft. And at last, in a hidden chamber, the truth revealed itself. The nervous teacher was not merely nervous. The shadow behind him was real. Voldemort was there, clinging to the back of another person's life, desperate and furious. The encounter did not end with the boy overpowering Voldemort through superior spells. The boy was too young, too inexperienced. It ended again with the old protection Voldemort despised. When Voldemort tried to seize the boy, to harm him directly, the touch itself burned. The mother's sacrifice, living in the boy's very skin, made contact poisonous to Voldemort's broken soul. It was as if love had become a shield that turned into fire against the thing that tried to devour it. Voldemort recoiled. His host was destroyed in the struggle, and Voldemort fled again, slipping away like smoke through cracks. He did not get the stone. He did not get his body. He did not get his elegant return. But he did learn something that mattered. He learned that as long as the boy was protected by that old magic, he could not simply kill him in the straightforward way he preferred. He could not simply cast a curse and be done with it. The protection would interfere. It would rebound, resist, burn. And Voldemort, who did not tolerate obstacles, began to plan around it. He would need a different method. A way to bypass the protection. A way to make the boy's shield irrelevant. He disappeared again, deeper, farther, weakened, but still alive, still anchored by the torn pieces of his soul. The world, seeing him vanish once more, tried again to relax, tried again to believe it was over. But now the boy knew the truth. Voldemort was not just history. Voldemort was a living danger. And Voldemort knew something too. The boy was not just a prophecy. The boy was a locked door, and Voldemort would have to find the right key. In the years that followed, the signs of Voldemort's influence began to surface again, in subtler ways. Not always directly through him, but through the residue of what he had built. Dark objects, cursed diaries, old followers still loyal, frightened opportunists, the echo of his ideology. Like mold in a house, his presence could grow again, even when the main source seemed gone. One year, a dark artifact was introduced into Hogwarts. A diary that seemed ordinary until it wasn't. It held a piece of Voldemort, preserved from his youth, clever and manipulative. Through that diary, he tried a different kind of return, not rebuilding his own body, but creating a new one from the memory of himself. A younger Voldemort, reborn through the stolen life of another. It was a frightening strategy, and it nearly worked, because Voldemort's greatest strength was not always raw power. It was persuasion. It was the ability to make someone feel seen and understood, then use that feeling like a chain. But again, he was stopped. The diary was destroyed, and with it, that fragment of him was destroyed too. Voldemort would have felt that loss like a snapped thread inside his own existence. Not emotionally, perhaps, but structurally, because these anchors mattered. They were not just insurance policies. They were parts of him. When one was destroyed, it meant his immortality was not invulnerable. It meant that someone, somewhere, could unmake what he had done. That possibility would have made him furious. It would also have made him more determined. He continued to gather strength slowly in hiding. He searched for loyal followers. He searched for opportunities. He searched for methods that did not require him to touch the boy directly. He needed a ritual, a loophole, a way to rewrite the rules. And eventually, in the shadowy corners of the world, he found what he needed, a servant desperate enough to bring him back. This servant sought him out, not because he was commanded, but because he chose to. He slipped through fear and secrecy, carrying pieces of information, small resources, and most importantly, a willingness to do whatever was asked. With that kind of servant, Voldemort's return became more than a dream. He began to construct a body. Not a full return, not yet, but a crude form that could hold him. A vessel built through dark magic and stolen ingredients. Something that looked like life but felt like a mockery of it. In that form, Voldemort could speak again, could see again, could command again. And once he could command, he could plan the real return. He designed a ritual that would allow him to bypass the boy's protection. The logic was cruel and clever. If he used the boy's blood to rebuild his own body, he believed he could take the protection into himself and neutralize it. If the boy's blood ran in Voldemort's veins, then the shield that burned him might stop burning. He could touch the boy. He could hurt him. He could kill him. To Voldemort, this was not just strategy. It was satisfaction. The idea of using the boy's own blood as the key felt like turning destiny inside out. He needed three things for the ritual: something from his own father's line, something from a loyal servant, and the blood of the enemy he intended to destroy. And he arranged the trap. The boy was drawn into a dangerous contest, a public spectacle meant to test magical skill, but secretly designed as bait. The final moment of that contest became a doorway, a forced transport that carried him away from safety, away from teachers, away from help, and into a graveyard where old bones lay under cold stars. There, in that lonely place surrounded by darkness and waiting enemies, the ritual was performed. Voldemort returned to a body. Not the handsome face of Tom Riddle, not the charming young man from the shop, but something new and terrible, pale and snake-like, with features that seemed carved from cruelty itself. This was not simply aging. It was the external truth of what he had done internally. A body shaped by the choices that had split him apart. He rose again, breathing, standing, alive. And for a moment, he savored it. He tested the air. He tested the weight of his wand. He looked at the boy and felt that old hatred flare. Not only hatred of a threat, but hatred of humiliation. Then he did what he always did. He performed a demonstration. He wanted his followers to see him returned. He wanted the world to feel the shock. He summoned his scattered loyalists, calling them back like wolves returning to a familiar whistle. They gathered, some trembling, some eager, some frightened but desperate to be forgiven. Voldemort punished those who had abandoned him, because fear must be maintained. He rewarded the servant who had restored him, because loyalty must be incentivized. And he made clear, with cold certainty, that the war was not over. It was beginning again. When he turned back to the boy, he did not kill him instantly. He wanted something more. He wanted a victory that would erase the story of his fall. He wanted to prove, in front of witnesses, that the boy was not special, not protected, not a legend. He wanted to destroy the symbol as much as the person. So he dueled him. The duel was uneven in power, but heavy with strange magic. Their wands, connected by shared history, produced an effect Voldemort did not anticipate. The air between them became a corridor of light, and echoes of Voldemort's past murders surfaced, not as gore, not as spectacle, but as haunting presences. The shadows of people he had killed, appearing briefly, offering the boy a moment of help, a chance to escape. Voldemort's control slipped for seconds that felt like minutes. The boy escaped the graveyard, carrying proof of Voldemort's return back to the wizarding world. And with that escape, the Second War began. But the wizarding world did not react cleanly. Some refused to believe it. Some called it hysteria. The ministry, fearful of panic and desperate to appear in control, dismissed the warning. Denial returned like a bad habit, because denial is quieter than truth. Voldemort used that denial to move. He began to rebuild his influence openly again, though still in the shadows. Attacks resumed, disappearances resumed. Fear seeped back into daily life like cold water into cracks. And now Voldemort had something else too. A new understanding of how to target the future. Because in coming back, in using the boy's blood, Voldemort had indeed changed the rules, but not entirely in the way he thought. He had taken the protection into himself, yes. He could touch the boy now without burning. He could harm him more directly, but by tying himself to the boy's blood, he also tied himself to the old sacrifice in a way that would later matter. Voldemort, in trying to bypass love, had unknowingly carried a piece of its logic inside him like a hidden seed. He did not notice. He believed he had outsmarted everything. From there, Voldemort moved with renewed ambition. He wanted control of the Ministry. He wanted control of Hogwarts. He wanted to eliminate Dumbledore, because Dumbledore was still the mind that could anticipate him, and he wanted to secure his immortality by protecting his hidden soul anchors, because now the idea that they could be destroyed was no longer theoretical. It was real. The war tightened. The world darkened again. And in the midst of it all, Voldemort's obsession with the boy became more personal, more consuming, not only because of prophecy, not only because of strategy, but because the boy represented a truth Voldemort could not bear. That there are kinds of power Voldemort cannot buy, steal, or force. And this is where the story begins to shift from Voldemort's rise into Voldemort's unraveling. Because the moment he returned, the clock began ticking toward the end he had tried to outrun for so long. And yet, even as he rose again, the seeds of his downfall were already planted inside the very things he trusted most. Voldemort returned with a single guiding belief: power should control everything. If power was absolute, then life was safe. If power was absolute, then death could be held at bay. If power was absolute, then love, friendship, loyalty, those messy, human, unreliable things, would become irrelevant. So he set out to crush the world into a shape he could hold. At first he moved carefully. He knew that the wizarding world had enjoyed a long breath of peace, and that a sudden open takeover might unite resistance too quickly. He preferred to split people, to confuse them, to make them unsure of what was happening and who was telling the truth. Voldemort understood fear, but he also understood uncertainty. Uncertainty makes people hesitate, and hesitation is the door that darkness slips through. So he let the world argue while he acted. Attacks increased. People disappeared. Strange marks appeared in places where they didn't belong. The Daily Prophet twisted the story into safer shapes. The Ministry insisted everything was under control. Voldemort watched all of it like someone watching pieces fall into place on a board. His followers, the Death Eaters, returned to him in waves, some eager, some ashamed, some simply terrified of being on the wrong side of him again. Voldemort did not forgive easily. He was not a leader who inspired love. He was a leader who trained people to obey through pain and humiliation. He made examples. He punished disloyalty publicly. He demanded devotion, the way a fire demands oxygen. And behind all of it, he was thinking about one thing more than anything else: how to make his immortality untouchable. Because he had learned a lesson in a way he hated. Immortality was not just about avoiding death. It was about avoiding vulnerability. It was about ensuring no one could unmake what he had done. And now he knew there were people who could unmake it. Voldemort did not know who exactly. He did not know how much they understood. But he suspected Dumbledore. He feared Dumbledore in the way he feared almost no one, not as an equal, but as an unpredictable force. A person who did not want power, and therefore could not be tempted by it. A person whose mind was sharp, and whose morals were strange to Voldemort. Because Voldemort had never believed anyone could truly choose goodness if it cost them something. Dumbledore was a problem. So Voldemort wanted him removed. But Voldemort also wanted Hogwarts. Hogwarts was more than a school. It was the heart of the wizarding world's identity. If you controlled Hogwarts, you controlled what children learned, what they believed, what they feared. You controlled the next generation. Voldemort understood that the future is easier to shape when it is young, and he wanted the future shaped into something that would never threaten him. But Hogwarts was protected. Not just by stone walls and enchantments, but by Dumbledore's presence. by teachers who were loyal to the school, and by the fact that Hogwarts was watched by the world in a way that made sudden violence difficult to hide. So Voldemort used methods that were quiet at first. He placed people where he needed them. He used the Ministry's denial to gain time. He built influence in the shadows, then began to push those shadows into the light. And slowly, the world began to tilt. The Ministry, in its fear, made mistake after mistake. It tried to silence dissent. It tried to control information. It tried to pretend that admitting the truth would create chaos, not realizing that lying was already creating chaos. Voldemort didn't even need to destroy the Ministry immediately. He only needed it weak, confused, and divided. That was enough. Meanwhile, Voldemort's obsession with the boy who lived continued to burn in the background. He had proven he could touch him now. He had proven he could duel him. He had proven the old protection no longer burned him like fire. But the boy still escaped. Voldemort could not tolerate that. And now, because he had returned, the prophecy that had once been a spark became a flame in his mind again. He began to focus on it, not just as a warning, but as a script. If a prophecy said, "One of them must fall at the hand of the other," Voldemort heard that like a command. He took it as an insult that fate had dared to mention him alongside anyone else. He needed the prophecy to end with only one name remaining, his. So he started to hunt for the full words. He wanted certainty. He believed certainty was safety. And in trying to secure that certainty, he stepped closer and closer to the trap his own fear had set. Because Voldemort had always been afraid of death, not in the shallow way people fear being hurt, but in the deep, gnawing way someone fears being erased. He could not bear the thought that one day the world might move on without him. He could not bear the thought that he was not the center of the story. Fear drove him the way love drives other people. And fear, when it drives you, makes you blind. While Voldemort worked to gain power and control the prophecy, Dumbledore worked quietly on a different truth, the truth of Voldemort's soul. Dumbledore did not simply suspect dark magic. He suspected something specific, and once he suspected it, he began to follow the trail of Voldemort's life, looking for patterns, looking for missing pieces, looking for the places where Voldemort's vanity would have left clues. Voldemort believed he was beyond everyone. That belief made him careless in one particular way. He left fragments of himself inside objects tied to his pride. He chose items that mattered to him, items connected to Hogwarts, connected to ancient wizarding families, connected to stories and symbols. His immortality was not just hidden, it was displayed, in a twisted way, like trophies, not openly, not in a museum, but in the choices he made about what was worthy of containing his soul. And Dumbledore understood that. So Dumbledore began to search for those anchors. He understood that as long as Voldemort's soul was fractured and anchored elsewhere, Voldemort could not truly be killed. He could be defeated, driven off, weakened, but not ended. If they wanted the war to finish, they would have to do something much harder than winning battles. They would have to unmake Voldemort's deepest work. They would have to destroy the pieces of him. This knowledge was heavy. It was secret. It was dangerous. And Dumbledore chose carefully whom to share it with. The boy who lived, now older and more aware, became part of this secret, because whether anyone liked it or not, Voldemort's story and the boy's story were tied together like knotted rope. The prophecy bound them, yes, but more than that, Voldemort had left a mark on the boy that was deeper than a scar. The connection between them was not just symbolic. It was magical, intimate, and wrong. The boy began to learn that Voldemort's mind could brush against his own, that Voldemort's emotions could leak into him sometimes, like cold water through a crack. That pain could come suddenly, sharp as a needle, when Voldemort was near, or furious, or thinking intensely about something. This connection frightened him, because it felt like losing control of his own thoughts. And Voldemort, sensing the connection too, began to use it as a tool whenever he could. Voldemort didn't understand love, but he understood invasion. He understood possession. He understood how to break boundaries. He tried to use the connection to spy, to manipulate, to lure the boy into traps. He planted images in the boy's mind, hoping he would run into danger without thinking. He treated the boy's empathy and instinct to help others like a weakness to exploit. And sometimes it worked, but not entirely, because what Voldemort did not understand was that the boy's greatest strength was not power, not talent, not fame. It was the same sort of stubborn love that had protected him as a baby, the instinct to care, even when caring hurt, the refusal to abandon people. Voldemort kept trying to twist that into a noose, and each time he did, he revealed how little he understood the weapon he was trying to use. As the war grew more intense, Voldemort's plans expanded. He began moving to take the ministry fully, not just influence it, but control it outright. He wanted laws that would serve him, not restrain him. He wanted official power to match his dark power. He wanted to reshape society into a hierarchy, built on blood and fear. And the ministry, already weak, began to collapse. Corruption spread like ink in water. People disappeared from positions of authority and were replaced by people who smiled too easily and asked too many questions. Public messaging changed. The language of fear became normal. Wizards who were once safe began to worry about being watched. It happened slowly enough that some people didn't notice until it was too late. And then it happened quickly. One day, the ministry was no longer a flawed government trying to cope with crisis. It was an occupied space, a puppet theater for Voldemort's will. Trials became performances. Accusations became weapons. Blood status became a legal category, as if prejudice could be stamped and filed and made respectable. Voldemort's ideology was always there beneath his actions, because he hated weakness and he equated weakness with impurity. He despised anyone who reminded him of the life he came from, the poor orphan, the powerless child. So he built a world that punished vulnerability and worshipped cruelty. This wasn't just politics to him. It was personal revenge against his own past. And now, with the ministry bending, he turned his gaze toward Hogwarts. Hogwarts, at this time, was still holding together under Dumbledore's leadership. It was still a place where students could learn, where the old magic could offer a kind of safety, but Voldemort knew Hogwarts could not remain free if he was to win. So he arranged the next strike, the removal of Dumbledore. Dumbledore's death was not random. It was the outcome of layered plans, manipulations, and sacrifices. Dumbledore, who knew he was running out of time, made choices that were meant to protect the future, even at the cost of his own life. He set traps inside traps. He guided people into positions where they could act when the moment came. And Voldemort, for all his intelligence, did not see all of it. He saw only the surface, a chance to remove the one person he feared most. So, when the moment arrived, Voldemort's followers moved like a coordinated storm. Hogwarts was breached. The castle that had held centuries of learning became a battleground of footsteps, shouts, spells. And at the top of the tallest tower, under a cold sky, Dumbledore was killed. This was a turning point in Voldemort's war, because Dumbledore's death was a symbol. It was the proof that Voldemort could reach anywhere. It was the proof that the old protection of tradition and reputation meant nothing against his will. Voldemort would have savored it. He would have felt the world shift under his feet, as if the board had finally tipped fully in his favor. And yet, quietly, this was also one of the moments that would undo him. Because Dumbledore's death did not end resistance. It intensified it. It removed one great mind, yes, but it also forced others to grow into roles they might have avoided. It pushed people into courage they didn't know they had. And it freed the boy who lived from the protective structure that had sometimes limited him. With Dumbledore gone, the war stopped being something that happened around the boy. It became something that happened through him. Now the boy and his closest friends stepped out of the ordinary rhythm of school life and into the hard, cold work of hunting Voldemort's hidden soul anchors. This part of the story is quieter than battles, but it is just as dangerous. It's a slow hunt through secrets and ruins and places soaked in old magic. It is nights spent hungry, afraid, hiding, arguing, pushing forward anyway. It is the realization that heroism is often not dramatic at all. It is often just refusing to stop. And while they hunted, Voldemort consolidated. He took Hogwarts. He placed loyal people in charge. He turned the school into a place of surveillance and punishment, a place where students were taught fear alongside spells. Hogwarts, once a sanctuary, became a training ground for obedience. He understood what that meant. He understood that if he could shape the next generation, his reign could last beyond any single war. So Hogwarts changed under his shadow. Students were separated. Some were favored. Some were targeted. Punishments became crueler. The bright, warm idea of the school dimmed into something tense and cold. The castle itself, with its moving staircases and portraits, felt like it was holding its breath. Voldemort's grip tightened. But again, his weakness remained the same. He believed fear was enough. He believed crushing people would make them loyal. He believed that if he controlled the law and the school and the newspapers, the story would belong to him. He did not understand that there are people who will resist not because they think they can win, but because they cannot bear the alternative. And among those people were children, young students who had grown up hearing stories of the previous war, who had been taught that bravery mattered, who had watched their world darken, and decided they would not accept it quietly. They formed secret groups. They supported each other. They learned to fight back in small ways that grew larger. Voldemort's attempt to turn Hogwarts into a cage created resistance. Inside the cage itself, this too would matter. Voldemort, meanwhile, became increasingly fixated on the prophecy again. He wanted the full words, and he wanted to interpret them in the most controlling way possible. He believed prophecy was something you could dominate by forcing it to play out on your terms. But prophecy, like fear, is tricky. The more Voldemort tried to control it, the more he trapped himself inside it. Because he could have chosen to ignore it. He could have chosen to let the boy live and focus on control elsewhere. He could have chosen to treat the prophecy as nonsense. But Voldemort could never ignore anything that hinted he might not be supreme. So he gave the prophecy power by believing in it. He built his actions around it. He shaped the war around it. And in doing so, he ensured that the boy would always be at the center of the story. The hunt for the soul anchors continued. One by one, these hidden objects were found and destroyed. Each destruction weakened Voldemort in a way he could not immediately measure. He still had a body. He still had power. He still had followers. But the structure of his immortality was being dismantled quietly, like removing beams from inside a great hall while the roof still looked stable. Voldemort sensed at times that something was wrong. He became more paranoid, more controlling. more violent. He punished mistakes more harshly. He demanded constant reassurance of loyalty. And because he did not understand his own vulnerability, he responded to that vague sense of danger by tightening his grip harder, like someone squeezing sand in their fist, only to have it slip through faster. He also began to rely more heavily on his most prized possessions, his wand, his reputation, his myth. But even his wand, his chosen tool, became a point of anxiety, because he had dueled the boy and experienced the strange connection between their wands. He feared that connection. He feared being humiliated again. He feared that the boy could survive him again. So Voldemort sought a solution in the way he always sought solutions, by reaching for greater, older power. He became obsessed with the idea of an unbeatable wand, a wand that could not fail him. This obsession was not just tactical, it was psychological. Voldemort needed to believe there was a tool, an object, a mechanism that could guarantee victory. He needed certainty the way other people need air. And he believed the legendary wand could give him that certainty. So he began to hunt for it. This hunt drew him into graveyards, into the history of wand makers, into the story of death itself. It pushed him toward acts of cruelty that revealed his desperation. He violated graves. He murdered people for information. He tore through the world like a storm, chasing a legend, because he could not bear the thought that his own power might not be enough. But this was another trap, because Voldemort's obsession with unbeatable power made him careless again. It made him focus on the wrong threat. It made him invest in myths rather than truths. And while he chased the wand, the real danger to him continued. The quiet destruction of his soul's anchors, the slow unmaking of his immortality. Now, with the Ministry controlled and Hogwarts occupied, Voldemort seemed unstoppable. To many, he looked like a king. But kings can fall. And Voldemort, despite all his power, had built his kingdom on fear and fractured soul pieces and lies. The foundation was brittle. The war moved toward its final act. The boy who lived returned to Hogwarts not as a student coming home, but as someone entering the heart of the enemy's territory. Resistance inside the castle rose with him. Old teachers returned. Former students came back. Families arrived. A castle filled with people willing to fight. Hogwarts, which Voldemort had tried to turn into a symbol of his control, became instead the place where people chose to stand against him. This was the final irony. Voldemort arrived with his army, with his followers, with his confidence. He believed the castle would fall. He believed he would crush the last resistance, and then end the boy in front of everyone. He believed the story would finally end with him as the sole surviving name, and the Battle of Hogwarts began. Spells filled the air like lightning. The grounds shook. Stone walls cracked. The school that had once been home to laughter and learning became a place of screams and courage. Creatures fought, teachers fought, students fought. People who had once been ordinary revealed extraordinary bravery simply because they refused to run any longer. In the chaos, Voldemort hunted the boy. He wanted to end it personally. But the boy was hunting something too. The last of Voldemort's soul anchors. As the battle raged, the final hidden pieces were destroyed, one after another, until Voldemort's immortality, his proudest achievement, was reduced to nothing but a body and a single, fragile soul fragment. Voldemort did not fully understand what was happening until it was almost too late. He could feel something slipping. He could feel that old panic, that cold dread he had tried to cut out of himself. Because immortality, for Voldemort, was never really about living forever. It was about never being powerless. And now, the possibility of powerlessness returned. But even then, even with the foundation collapsing, Voldemort could not change. He could not become different. He could not stop fearing death long enough to make a wiser choice. He doubled down. He struck harder. He tried to kill more quickly. He demanded surrender. He offered mercy in words, but his mercy was always a lie. It was always a trap. It was always domination dressed up as choice. And then, in the midst of the battle, Voldemort made the most important move of all. One that would decide the ending, even if he didn't realize it. He killed someone else in an act that mirrored the old sacrifice. And by doing so, he unintentionally extended protection over the people he was trying to crush. Because love and sacrifice, those forces Voldemort dismissed, were still working, still weaving through the story like threads of gold. Voldemort didn't see the gold. He saw only red. He marched toward the final confrontation, believing his victory was inevitable. He did not realize how close he already was to the edge. The night at Hogwarts didn't feel like one night. It felt like many nights layered on top of each other, like pages pressed together, until you couldn't separate where one moment ended and the next began. Smoke curled through corridors that had once smelled of parchment and polish. Broken stone lay scattered like pale bones across the floors. Portraits had gone quiet, some torn, some missing, some staring with a kind of stunned sadness, as if they couldn't understand how the castle they loved had become a battlefield. And Voldemort moved through it all like a force that believed the world existed only to be rearranged for him. He was not calm in the gentle way calm can soothe. He was calm in the way ice can be calm, hard, absolute, and convinced that nothing should be allowed to grow. His followers held the edges of the grounds, sent dark spells into the night, and called out warnings that sounded like demands. Surrender. Kneel. Give up the boy. Hand him over. And this ends. Voldemort wanted the end to be public. He wanted everyone to see it. He wanted the wizarding world to understand that this wasn't a rumor, or a fear, or a possibility. It was a verdict. And somewhere inside him, deep and hidden even from himself, there was the same childish need that had always lived in him, the need to prove he was untouchable, to prove that even fate, even prophecy, even the old stories about love and sacrifice would bend in front of him. That need guided him as much as strategy did. Because Voldemort had always been a man who believed he could write the final line of every story. Inside the castle, resistance held together by sheer will. People fought, not because they believed they couldn't lose, but because they believed losing would be worse than death. Teachers who had spent their lives correcting homework now hurled defensive spells that shook the air. Former students returned with fierce eyes and shaking hands, and the kind of bravery that comes from deciding, once and for all, that you will not be bullied into silence. Even the castle itself seemed to lean into the fight. Doors shifting, staircases turning, old magic waking like a lion that had been sleeping for centuries. But in the center of it, woven through the chaos, the boy who lived was moving towards something Voldemort couldn't see clearly. He wasn't just dodging attacks. He wasn't just surviving. He was completing the final pieces of a plan that had been made in whispers and secrets and grief, a plan that required him to understand something Voldemort never would. That victory is not always taking. Sometimes victory is giving. Sometimes victory is letting go. Voldemort was hunting him, yes. But he was also hunting something else. Certainty. Proof. the guarantee that his wand would never fail him, that his power would be absolute, that he would never again feel the humiliation of a spell rebounding, of a child escaping, of death touching him. This was why he had chased the legend of the unbeatable wand with such desperation. He had taken it not as a tool, but as a symbol. He believed it would erase doubt. But doubt doesn't disappear because you hold a powerful object. Doubt disappears when you accept the truth. And Voldemort could not accept the truth. The truth was that he was mortal. The truth was that he had spent his life trying to outrun a shadow that lived inside him. The truth was that every time he tried to escape fear, he made fear stronger. Still, he marched through the night toward the final confrontation, demanding surrender. He did it the way tyrants do it, loudly, publicly, as if volume could turn people into obedience. And then the battle paused. Not because peace had arrived, but because Voldemort forced the world to pause. He called a halt. He demanded silence. He offered what he called mercy, but it wasn't mercy. It was a trade made with a knife at the throat. He said he would stop the killing if the boy came forward. He said the rest could live if the one person he wanted most was handed to him. He was trying to isolate the boy, to turn love into betrayal, because Voldemort assumed that people were fundamentally selfish. He assumed that if you threatened them enough, they would do what was safest for themselves. He assumed that the boy's friends would eventually choose survival over loyalty. It was, in a strange way, the purest glimpse into Voldemort's mind. He couldn't imagine anyone choosing sacrifice. He couldn't imagine anyone choosing love when love demanded pain. He couldn't imagine what it meant to have people who would rather die together than live alone. So he made his offer, and the castle held its breath. Inside, people gathered in broken rooms, in shattered hallways, in half-lit spaces where dust floated like tiny ghosts. They argued. They pleaded. They cried. They held each other. They tried to decide what to do with an impossible choice. And the boy, older now, scarred by years of being hunted, listened with a stillness that didn't mean he was unafraid. It meant he understood. He understood the final truth that Dumbledore had guided him toward. He understood that Voldemort could not be ended until the last fragment of Voldemort's soul was vulnerable. And he understood something even more unbearable. He understood that the last fragment was not hidden in a cup or a locket or a ring or a diadem. It was hidden in him. This is the point in Voldemort's story where you finally see the cost of his choices with perfect clarity. Because he had tried to split his soul so many times, tried to anchor himself everywhere, tried to force immortality into the world, like nails hammered into wood, and in doing so he had created a weakness he would never anticipate. He had made himself dependent on fragile things. He had made his life a puzzle that could be solved. He had made his immortality something that could be undone. And the cruelest irony of all was that he had done it to himself, out of fear. So the boy chose to walk, not because he wanted to die, not because he was tired, not because he was giving up, but because he was doing what Voldemort could never understand. He was choosing to protect people, even if it cost him everything. This wasn't dramatic in the way Voldemort would have wanted. There were no speeches for the audience, no grand proclamation. It was quiet. It was heavy. It was the kind of bravery that feels like walking through deep water, step by step with your lungs burning and still moving forward. The boy left the castle. The night air outside was cold and sharp. The trees of the forbidden forest stood like tall shadows. The ground was damp. The sky overhead was wide and indifferent. And he walked into the forest toward Voldemort. Voldemort waiting with his followers, believed he had won. He believed the boy had finally surrendered. He believed this was the proof the world needed. He could not see what the boy was actually doing. He could not see that the boy was stepping into the end of Voldemort's immortality. And when Voldemort raised his wand, he did it with a kind of satisfaction that was almost peaceful. He spoke the killing curse as if he were speaking a final signature on a document. Green light flashed, and for a moment, everything that mattered hinged on something Voldemort didn't believe in: sacrifice. The boy fell. Voldemort believed it was over. He believed the prophecy was satisfied. He believed the world would now belong to him without question. But what happened next was not the simple ending Voldemort had imagined, because Voldemort had never understood what sacrifice does in magic. He thought killing was the ultimate act of power. He thought death was the final word. But sacrifice is a kind of magic Voldemort never learned, because it requires you to value someone else more than yourself. It requires you to accept vulnerability. It requires you to embrace the very thing Voldemort had run from his entire life: the possibility that love is stronger than fear. In the strange space that followed, the space between life and death, between breath and silence, the boy encountered the quiet truth of what Voldemort had done to himself. The part of Voldemort's soul that had latched onto him like a parasite, like a stain, was destroyed by the curse meant to kill the boy. And with that, Voldemort's immortality cracked completely. The last anchor was gone. Voldemort, standing in the forest, did not know it. Not immediately. He still felt powerful. He still felt alive. He still felt like a storm. But now, for the first time since he was a teenager, carving his soul into pieces, Voldemort was fully mortal again. And mortality, to Voldemort, was terror. Still, he returned to the castle grounds with his followers. He announced the boy's death. He tried to break the spirit of everyone watching. He tried to make grief into surrender. He carried the boy's body like a trophy, as if proving death belonged to him. But even then, the world didn't respond the way Voldemort expected, because people didn't fold the way paper folds when you press it. They staggered. They screamed. They sobbed. And then, slowly, something else happened. They stood up. Not all at once. Not in a perfectly heroic wave. Real courage doesn't look like that. Real courage looks like shaking hands and tears and fear, and still deciding to move anyway. A spark of defiance flickered again. Voldemort had underestimated what he had created. By forcing the boy into sacrifice, he had extended protection over the people the boy was trying to save. He had, without understanding it, reenacted the very kind of ancient magic that had once protected the boy as a baby. He had done it again. And this time, it protected more than one person. It spread through the defenders of Hogwarts like a shield. Voldemort's curses began to feel wrong. Not powerless, but unreliable. Like the world itself was refusing to cooperate fully with his cruelty. Like something old and deep was pushing back. Voldemort hated that feeling. He responded the way he always responded: with rage. The battle resumed, but now the defenders fought with something new: hope. Not the naive kind that assumes everything will be fine, but the fierce kind that says, even if this ends badly, we will not become what you want us to be. And in the middle of the chaos, the boy who had been carried in as dead opened his eyes. He didn't stand up in front of everyone. He didn't reveal himself with a shout. He moved quietly through the crowd, slipping back into the castle, because he understood that Voldemort's greatest weakness now was not his power. It was his belief. Voldemort believed he had already won, and a person who believes the end has already been written becomes careless. Now we come to another thread in Voldemort's story that matters deeply. The wand. The unbeatable wand Voldemort had hunted so obsessively, believing it would secure victory, was not loyal to him in the way he assumed. Voldemort didn't understand wand loyalty, because wand loyalty is not about domination. It's about a kind of recognition. A wand responds to certain truths. Strength, yes, but not simply brute force. There are rules woven into the magic that do not care what Voldemort thinks should be true. Voldemort believed taking a wand meant owning it. He believed stealing meant mastering. But magic doesn't always follow theft, and the wand he craved had already shifted its allegiance through the chain of conflict, through acts of disarming, through the quiet laws of wand law Voldemort never respected. So Voldemort marched toward what he thought would be the final duel, with a weapon that was not truly his. He didn't know it. He couldn't imagine it. Because imagining it would mean accepting that something outside his control existed. And Voldemort could never accept that. The final confrontation came not in the hidden shadows of the forest, but in the open. Because this is what Voldemort wanted. A stage. An audience. Proof. He faced the boy in the ruined heart of Hogwarts, with survivors watching, with fighters holding their breath, with grief and rage hanging in the air like smoke. Voldemort spoke like someone delivering a sentence. The boy spoke like someone delivering the truth. And the truth was the most dangerous thing Voldemort could hear. Not that Voldemort was powerful, not that Voldemort was feared, but that Voldemort was wrong. Wrong about the prophecy. Wrong about immortality. Wrong about love. Wrong about the wand. The boy named Voldemort's history out loud, not as flattery, not as fear, but as fact. He exposed the hidden anchors, the fractured soul, the desperate attempts at immortality. He revealed that Voldemort's protections were gone. He revealed that Voldemort had made himself mortal again. To Voldemort, this was not just an accusation. It was humiliation. His face tightened. His eyes sharpened. His rage rose like fire fed by oil. And still he could not accept that the boy might be right. He cast the killing curse again, because it was the one answer Voldemort always trusted. The boy cast his spell in return. 2 flashes. 2 streams of magic. And because the wand Voldemort held did not truly belong to him, because the wand's loyalty lay elsewhere, because the foundations of Voldemort's immortality had been dismantled, because his soul was no longer anchored in hidden trophies, Voldemort's curse rebounded. This time, there was no fragment left to cling to life, no hidden anchor, no path back. Voldemort fell. Not with a grand mythic transformation, not with a dramatic disappearance into smoke, but as a body hitting the ground, sudden and final. And that mattered. Because Voldemort had spent his life trying to become more than human, trying to become a legend, trying to become something beyond death. And in the end, he was what he had always feared most. Mortal. Gone. The silence after was not immediately joyful. It was stunned. People looked at each other as if they couldn't understand that the weight pressing on the world had lifted. Some cried. Some laughed in disbelief. Some simply sat down on broken stone and stared, shaking, as if their bodies didn't know how to stop fighting. Because surviving is strange like that. It doesn't feel like triumph at first. It feels like emptiness, where terror used to be. Slowly, sound returned. Voices rose. Names were called out. People searched for friends. They found some alive. They found some dead. They clung to each other and breathed like they were learning how to breathe again. And Voldemort's followers, those who remained, either fled or were captured, or stood frozen, suddenly aware that the thing they had worshipped was gone. Now, the story of Voldemort becomes a story of aftermath, because endings are never clean. The defeat of Voldemort didn't erase the damage he'd done. It didn't bring back the dead. It didn't instantly heal the fear people had lived with for years. It didn't immediately mend every fracture in society, but it did something essential. It gave the world permission to begin again. The ministry, corrupted and occupied, had to be rebuilt. People who had been persecuted had to be protected, not just with words, but with laws, with accountability, with the slow work of trust. Trials would follow, confessions, denials, arguments. The complicated truth that many people had been frightened into compliance would have to be faced. Because rebuilding is not just about celebrating victory, it's about learning how to stop the conditions that allowed darkness to rise in the first place. And Hogwarts had to be repaired, stone by stone and spirit by spirit. The castle could be mended with magic, yes. Walls could be rebuilt. Towers could be restored. But the real repair would take longer. It would take time for students to walk through those halls again without flinching. Time for laughter to return without guilt. Time for the portraits to stop whispering and start gossiping again like they used to. And in the center of it all is the question Voldemort never asked. What is a life for? Voldemort's life, if you look back across it, was shaped by one obsession: refusing to be powerless. He feared death so completely that he became cruel. He feared weakness so completely that he built a world designed to punish vulnerability. He feared being unloved so completely that he made himself unlovable. He never allowed himself to be held by anyone. He never allowed himself to need anyone. And because of that, he never allowed himself the one thing that could have made life worth living: connection. Voldemort collected followers, but not friends. He collected trophies, but not tenderness. He collected fear, but not trust. In the end, his power did not protect him from the one truth he couldn't accept: that life is fragile no matter how much you try to control it. And the story's final lesson, gentle but firm, rests there. You cannot outrun death by becoming a monster. You cannot outrun fear by spreading fear. You cannot build immortality out of broken soul fragments and expect it to feel like living. Voldemort's name became, after his fall, something people spoke more easily. Not because it wasn't terrifying, but because it was no longer a spell that controlled them. It became history, a warning, a story told to remind people what happens when power becomes the only thing you worship. And the boy who lived, now no longer a boy, not truly, carried what he had endured into the rest of his life. He carried grief. He carried scars. He carried the weight of people lost. But he also carried something Voldemort never had: people beside him. Because the true opposite of Voldemort was not just a hero with a wand. It was a community, a family, made from friendships, a world that decided again and again that love was worth the risk. That is how Voldemort's story ends. Not with his victory, not with his immortality, but with the proof that the things he dismissed, loyalty, sacrifice, compassion, were real forces, deep enough to undo even the darkest magic. After Voldemort fell, the world did not become quiet all at once. It would have been easier if it had. Easier if the moment his body hit the stone floor, every scream in the castle faded into silence, every flame went out politely, Every broken wall stood up straight again, and every person who had ever lived in fear suddenly felt safe. But life doesn't work like that, and neither does magic. A war leaves echoes. It leaves smoke in the lungs and trembling in the hands. It leaves people blinking at sunlight, as if they've forgotten how to stand in it. So the first hours after his death were messy. They were filled with noise that didn't know what shape it should take anymore. Shouts of names, urgent, desperate, people searching for friends, for siblings, for teachers, for anyone who might still be alive. The scrape of rubble being pulled away. The crackle of small fires still burning stubbornly in broken corners. The strange hush that fell sometimes when someone found a body and didn't know what to say. In the great hall where the wounded were gathered, the air smelled of blood, smoke, damp stone, and something faintly metallic from spells that had scorched the walls. People lay on tables that had once been set with food and laughter. Others sat on the floor with blank eyes and shaking shoulders. Healers moved among them, sleeves rolled up, faces tight with focus, hands glowing with pale magic as they mended what they could. But some things couldn't be mended like that. There were deaths that sat like heavy stones in the center of the room, and there was the simple, brutal truth. Voldemort's end did not rewrite the hours before it. It didn't rewind the curses that had landed. It didn't undo the choices people had made when they were desperate. It didn't bring back the ones who had fallen in the fight to stop him. Victory, when it arrived alongside grief. That was the first lesson the survivors learned. The second lesson was even harder. Voldemort was gone, but the world he had tried to shape still existed. The ideology did not vanish with him. The hatred did not evaporate. The prejudice did not neatly pack itself away. The fear that had lived inside so many people did not disappear overnight. In fact, sometimes, fear becomes most confusing when the thing you feared is gone. Because you've organized your entire body around survival, and then suddenly you are not sure who you are without the threat. Some people cried because they were relieved. Some cried because they were furious they had lost years to terror. Some cried because they couldn't stop. Their bodies had learned the habit of weeping, and some couldn't cry at all. Their faces were stiff, their eyes dry, their minds trapped in that numb, distant place where emotion feels like something happening to someone else. Outside the castle, the grounds were scarred. Craters pocked the earth. Trees were splintered. The air was heavy with ash and the scent of rain beginning to fall. Gentle at first, as if the sky itself was trying to soothe the burned land. The forbidden forest stood tall and shadowed, its edges quiet now, as if it too was holding a breath. Dawn came slowly, and with it came something strange. People began to speak Voldemort's name without flinching. Not everyone, not immediately, but it happened. A few people whispered it, testing whether the air would crack or the night would punish them. Nothing happened. The world did not split open, and so the name became, little by little, just a name. A name for a man who had died. That mattered more than it might seem. Because Voldemort had fed on silence. He had fed on fear so strong that it turned words into taboos. He had made himself into a shadow that lived in people's mouths and refused to leave. And now, slowly, the shadow was shrinking. But what remained was the question of what to do with the wreckage. Hogwarts was a home for many, but it was also a symbol. Its walls had been attacked, its towers damaged, its corridors stained by battle. Rebuilding it would mean more than repairing stone. It would mean repairing a sense of safety. So, in the days after the battle, witches and wizards returned not with wands raised in violence, but with wands raised in work. They repaired walls. They lifted broken beams. They restored staircases. They soothed the portraits that had been torn and burned. They coaxed the enchanted suits of armor back into their proper places, and the castle responded. There was a particular feeling in Hogwarts that only people who had lived there could recognize. An old, warm hum, like the building itself was alive and mildly amused by everything. After the battle, that hum felt bruised, quieter, uncertain. But as people mended it, it began to return. Not quickly, but steadily. In the great hall, the shattered windows were repaired. The ceiling enchantment, which had reflected the storm of the battle, slowly returned to calm skies. The benches were reassembled. The long tables were polished again. And yet, even when the room looked like itself, it did not feel the same, because memory clung to the place. Everywhere survivors looked, they saw not only the room in front of them, but the room as it had been in the worst moments of the night, the floor where someone had fallen, the corner where someone had cried, the space where someone's voice had been silenced forever. There were memorials. At first they were small, a cluster of flowers placed on a step, a scarf folded neatly on a bench, a candle burning under a portrait. Then they became more formal. Names were written. Names were spoken. Names were carved into stone, because if you cannot bring someone back, you can at least refuse to let them vanish. And all across magical Britain, people began to emerge from hiding. Some had been in safe houses. Some had been in cellars. Some had been on the run, moving from place to place with only a few belongings, and the constant awareness that one wrong choice could mean capture or death. Now they returned. And they returned to a world that needed to decide what justice looked like. This was not simple, because wars do not divide people into neat categories of good and evil. Voldemort's core followers, the ones who had chosen cruelty with open eyes, were still there if they survived. Some fled. Some were captured. Some attempted to disguise themselves as innocent, claiming they had been forced. Some truly had been forced. Some had been threatened into compliance. Some had been under curses that twisted their will. Some had cooperated out of fear, and some had cooperated because it benefited them. Sorting through that was like trying to untangle wet string. The ministry had been corrupted deeply. It had been controlled. Its symbols had been twisted, its laws turned into weapons. Rebuilding it meant more than replacing a few officials. It meant asking hard questions that people would rather avoid. Who enabled this? Who looked away? Who accepted it because it was convenient? Who said, "I'm not political," while their neighbors were hunted? Voldemort's rise had not happened in a vacuum. It had happened because a society that already carried prejudice and fear had allowed a man like him to gain power. And if the world wanted to be safe, it would have to face that. So there were trials, there were hearings, there were testimonies that shook rooms with sobbing. Some people were convicted, sent to Azkaban, their names forever tied to the crimes they committed. Some were cleared. Some lived in the gray area that history always holds. People who had done wrong things out of terror. People who had done right things too late. People who had tried to survive in a world that punished courage. It was not satisfying. Justice rarely is. But it was necessary. And while Britain rebuilt itself, the survivors rebuilt themselves too, not with spells, with time. Time was the one thing Voldemort could not steal forever. Time meant wounds could close. Time meant nightmares could soften. Time meant laughter could return without feeling like betrayal. But time did not erase scars. The boy who had faced Voldemort, who had been hunted from childhood, was now free in a way he had never been before. And freedom, surprisingly, was its own challenge, because what do you do when the thing that has shaped every day of your life is gone? He had friends, yes. He had people who loved him. He had a community. But he also had the quiet moments. But the moments when he stood in a room alone and felt the absence of fear, like an empty chair. In those moments, he would remember everything. He would remember being a child in a cupboard, believing he was unwanted. He would remember letters arriving like birds in a storm. He would remember stepping into a world of magic and thinking he had finally found belonging. He would remember learning, slowly, that his fame was not a gift, it was a burden. He would remember the first time he saw Voldemort, not as a story, but as a living threat. He would remember the cemetery. He would remember the Department of Mysteries, the grief of loss, the anger he couldn't contain. He would remember the long year of being hunted, hungry, cold, sleeping in tents, listening for footsteps. He would remember the battle. He would remember walking into the forest, thinking he would never see the sun again. And he would remember standing up afterward, alive. Living through something that should have killed you changes you. You can never go back to the person you were before. But you can become something new. And the world gave him space to do that. There were celebrations, yes. There were moments of joy. People needed joy the way they needed air. But there was also respect for the weight of what had happened. People understood, in a way they hadn't before, that heroism is not glamorous. It is exhausting. It is painful. It is lonely sometimes. And so gradually, the boy began to live a life that was not defined only by war. He worked. He loved. He argued with friends about small, ordinary things. He learned how to sit in a room without feeling like he should be planning for death. Others did the same. Those who had fought beside him carried their own scars. Some were visible. Some were hidden. Some were in the way. They flinched at sudden noises. Some were in the way. They couldn't sleep without a light on. Some were in the way they held their loved ones too tightly, as if afraid the world would steal them again. Healing did not happen in a straight line. Some days were fine. Some days were worse than the worst days during the war. Because during the war you were busy surviving. After the war, you had time to feel everything you had buried. This was when grief became loud. People who had kept moving now stopped. And when they stopped, the pain caught up to them. There were funerals. There were memorial services. There were quiet conversations where someone finally said out loud, "I don't know how to be okay." And there were other people who answered, "You don't have to be okay yet. Just be here." It was in those conversations that the world began to truly change. Because Voldemort's greatest damage had not been the spells. It had been what he tried to do to the human spirit. He tried to make people believe they were alone. He tried to make them believe that kindness was weakness and fear was wisdom. He tried to make them believe that cruelty was inevitable. And every time someone chose to comfort someone else, every time someone chose to rebuild, every time someone chose to listen instead of judge, they were undoing him, bit by bit. Now, this is the part of the story where we return gently to Voldemort himself, not to honor him, not to excuse him, but to understand what his end meant. Voldemort had built his life around one idea: control. He wanted to control. He wanted to control other people. He wanted to control the story the world told about him. But the end of his story slipped out of his hands. He died not as a legend, but as a man who had made himself fragile through desperation. His body lay there, undeniable proof that power is not the same as permanence. His followers tried, in the months and years after, to reshape his story. Some claimed he was misunderstood. Some tried to turn him into a martyr. Some hid what they had done. Some denied. Some tried to rewrite history the way Voldemort had wanted to rewrite life. But the world had learned something. They had seen what Voldemort really was. They had seen the cost. And the survivors refused to let the truth be twisted again. Schools taught about the war, not as a thrilling adventure, but as a warning. People learned the names of those who had died, not just the names of the famous. They learned that ordinary courage mattered. They learned that small choices, refusing to laugh at cruelty, refusing to repeat hateful beliefs, refusing to stay silent, could shape the future as much as grand battles. And Hogwarts became, again, a school. Not just a fortress. Students returned. They walked through repaired corridors and looked at the scars in the stone and understood that the castle had survived something terrible. They sat in classrooms and listened to lessons while the wind howled outside, and they felt safe enough to complain about homework again. There is a particular magic in that, the magic of ordinary life returning, the magic of someone rolling their eyes at a teacher's lecture, because it means they expect a future. And in the end, that is the true opposite of Voldemort. Voldemort was a man who tried to stop time. He tried to freeze the world in fear, so he could stand above it forever. But life, stubborn and bright, kept moving. Seasons changed. Children grew. People fell in love. People argued. People made mistakes. People laughed. People lived. And that was the final defeat Voldemort could never accept. Not just that he died, but that the world kept going without him. That his name became history. That his fear became a lesson. That his attempt to become immortal ended in a quiet truth. You cannot build eternity from terror. You can only build a future from connection. And so, magical Britain, bruised and grieving, stepped forward. Not perfectly, not quickly, but honestly. Step by step, it learned to choose a different kind of power. Not domination, not control, but care. In the years that followed, the wizarding world did what it always does after surviving something unspeakable. It tried to become ordinary again, not because it forgot what happened, but because ordinary life is how people prove to themselves that horror did not win. Ordinary life is the stubborn, quiet rebellion of a morning cup of tea, a child's laughter in a garden, the creak of a shop door opening on Diagon Alley, the rustle of parchment in a classroom. Ordinary life is how you stitch a torn world back together, one small, human moment at a time. And yet, even as the world returned to routines, the story of Voldemort continued to live in the spaces between those routines, like a shadow that had finally learned where it was allowed to exist. Not on the throat, not in the air like poison, but in memory, where it could be faced and understood. Because Voldemort's story did not end with his death in the Great Hall. His story ended, truly, when people decided what to do with what he left behind. And what he left behind was more than rubble and grief. He left behind questions. What does a society do after it has been so easily turned into a weapon? How do people rebuild trust when fear taught them to suspect their neighbors? How do you raise children in a world where you know, now, that evil can wear a friendly face and speak in polite voices? And how do you prevent a new Voldemort from rising in the cracks of old prejudice? For a while, the answers came slowly, but they came. The Ministry of Magic could not simply pretend it was the same institution it had been before. Too many people remembered the propaganda. Too many people remembered the trials that were not trials at all, the registrations, the disappearances. Too many people remembered how quickly ordinary rules had been twisted into chains. So the ministry was forced to change, not only in personnel, but in structure. Investigations were launched, records were examined, corrupt officials were removed, Aurora offices were reorganized. Some laws were repealed and replaced. There were commissions, hearings, debates that lasted long into the night. Not everyone agreed on what reform should look like. Some people wanted swift punishment, sweeping changes, dramatic statements. Others wanted stability first. They were exhausted. They were afraid that too much change too quickly would break what little remained. But the war had taught the world something sharp and unavoidable. Ignoring problems does not make them disappear. It only makes them more likely to explode later. And so, slowly, reforms took root. One of the most important changes was not a law, but an attitude. The wizarding world truly began, to question pure blood ideology in a way it had never been forced to before. Before Voldemort, prejudice had existed in comfortable forms. It had been dressed up as tradition, as family pride, as natural order. People could pretend it was harmless because it was often spoken with smiles, behind closed doors, in drawing rooms where silverware shone, and no one had to look directly at the pain those ideas caused. Voldemort stripped that comfort away. He took prejudice to its logical conclusion. He showed what happens when you treat some people as lesser. He showed what happens when you decide that blood determines worth. And once the world had seen that, it was harder, though not impossible, for people to hide behind polite excuses. There were still those who clung to old beliefs. There were still families who muttered about loss of tradition and dangerous changes. There were still people who resented Muggle-born witches and wizards for surviving, for thriving, for existing at all. But the difference now was this. Those beliefs were no longer safe to say aloud without consequence. Not everywhere, not always. But more and more, the world pushed back. Teachers taught differently. Parents spoke differently. Friends corrected friends. People who had once stayed silent learned to speak, because they understood now what silence can cost. And in Hogwarts, this shift could be felt most clearly. Hogwarts reopened, not as it had been, but as it needed to be. The castle was repaired, yes, but it carried its scars openly. Some marks were left intentionally. A cracked stone here, a burned beam there, reminders that the place had fought and bled. And the school's culture changed too. It had to. Students returned with stories their parents had never needed to carry at that age. Children who had been hidden away now came back into the world with eyes that knew too much. Older students who had fought in the battle returned to finish their education. But the word education felt almost strange to them now. They had learned lessons far beyond any textbook. There were counselors, though the wizarding world didn't always use that exact word. Healers trained in mind magic, mediate witches who understood trauma, older professors who knew that sometimes the most important thing you can do for a young person is give them patience. There were memorials in the corridors. There were moments of silence. There were lessons about the war, taught carefully, not as drama, not as legend, but as history with living consequences. And there were also, mercifully, ordinary things. Quidditch matches, arguments about house points, friendships that formed in the usual awkward ways, with laughter and late-night whispered conversations. In the evenings, the fires in the common rooms crackled again. Students complained about essays again. They fell asleep over books again. It was in those small moments that the world healed. And as the world healed, Voldemort's story became something else. It became a cautionary tale, not the kind told to frighten children into behaving, but the kind told to teach them how to recognize danger, long before it wears a mask. Because Voldemort had not risen overnight. His rise had been a slow creep of fear and charisma, of whispered promises and easy scapegoats. He gave people someone to blame. He gave them an identity that felt powerful. He made them feel chosen, special, superior, and those are the most dangerous words a tyrant can offer. You are better than them. Once you accept that lie, cruelty becomes simple. So the wizarding world began teaching a different lesson. No one's blood makes them better. No one's power makes them more deserving of life. No one's fear excuses harm. Now, away from institutions and politics, away from reforms and trials, there were the personal lives of the people who had survived. And this is where Voldemort's story became most intimate. Because the war had left behind a generation marked by him, even after his death. Some of them built lives quickly, as if rushing to fill the space that fear had stolen. Others moved slowly, unsure how to trust the future. Some married, had children, tried to create warmth and stability because they knew now how fragile those things are. Some struggled, haunted by nightmares, by guilt, by memories that would not soften. Some found purpose in work, becoming auras, healers, teachers, activists, builders of a new world. Some simply tried to live, and living, after surviving Voldemort, was an act of courage all on its own. It is easy to imagine that after the final battle, everything became bright and easy. But the truth is gentler and more complex. Healing does not happen because a villain dies. Healing happens because people keep choosing it, day after day. And sometimes, choosing healing feels like betrayal. There were moments when survivors felt guilty for laughing, for enjoying food, for feeling peace. Because how could they be happy when others were gone? How could they walk in sunshine when so many were buried? This is one of grief's cruel tricks. It whispers that joy is disrespect. But slowly people learn the truth. Joy is not betrayal. Joy is survival. Joy is what the dead would want for the living. And in time, laughter returned without the sting of guilt. Not always. Not perfectly, but often enough to matter. Now, let's return to Voldemort one last time. Not as a monster on a battlefield, but as a figure in the world's memory. Because there is something important about how Voldemort is remembered. For years, he had tried to control the narrative of who he was. He wanted to be mythic, unstoppable, beyond human. He wanted to be remembered as a force of nature, a dark god who could not be truly harmed. But history did not grant him that. History did something more humiliating. History reduced him. Not by denying what he did, never that, but by describing him accurately. He became, in records and lessons and testimonies, a man who was terrified of death. A man who was brilliant, but warped. A man who could not love. A man who thought fear was strength. A man who tore his own soul apart and called it victory. A man who, in the end, died like any other man. The wizarding world did not forget his crimes. His victims were named. His horrors were documented. His ideology was studied as a disease that could return if ignored. But the world refused to romanticize him. That was crucial, because romanticizing evil makes it attractive to the desperate. And Voldemort had always preyed on desperation. So instead, people told the truth. They told about his childhood, not to pity him, but to show where neglect and cruelty can leave cracks in a person. They told about his choices, not to excuse them, but to prove that he could have chosen differently, because that too was important. Voldemort was not inevitable. He was not destiny. He was a person who made decisions. He chose manipulation over friendship. He chose power over kindness. He chose control over connection. He chose to treat other lives as expendable. He chose, and because he chose, the world could teach future generations that they too have choices, even when they are afraid, even when they are angry, even when the world feels unfair. They can choose not to become him. They can choose not to follow someone like him. They can choose to resist. This became the heart of the lesson. And perhaps the most meaningful part of Voldemort's story is not that he existed, but that he was stopped. Not by a single heroic moment, though there were heroic moments, but by countless acts of bravery, large and small, by people hiding others in their homes, by people refusing to betray friends, by people standing up in meetings and saying, by teachers protecting students, by families loving each other through terror, by friends staying together, by a society, at last, learning that fear must be challenged, not obeyed. This is what Voldemort could not understand. He believed people would always choose themselves. He believed love was weakness. He believed loyalty was foolish. He believed fear was the strongest force in the world. And he was wrong. Because the force that defeated him over and over, in different forms, was not a clever spell, not an army, not a prophecy. It was people refusing to let fear turn them into monsters. It was people choosing love anyway. And that is the true end of his story, not his death. But the world moving forward, the world remembering, the world teaching, the world rebuilding, the world living. If you step into Diagon Alley years later, you might see children running past the shop windows, eyes wide with wonder, dreaming of wands and adventure. You might hear parents telling them stories, carefully, gently, about a time when darkness nearly swallowed everything. And in those stories, Voldemort is not glamorous. He is not a dark prince. He is not a romantic villain. He is what he always was beneath the theatrics, a warning. A reminder of what happens when fear rules. A reminder of what happens when you let prejudice grow unchecked. A reminder of what happens when you chase immortality so desperately that you destroy your own humanity. And then the story continues past him, because life continues past him. Children grow up, friendships form, new teachers arrive at Hogwarts. The castle stands, old and stubborn and alive. The lake reflects the sky. The giant squid drifts lazily beneath the surface. Owls carry letters. Candles float in the air. And somewhere, in a quiet corner of the world, someone who once lived in fear wakes up, stretches, makes breakfast, and thinks, sometimes with surprise, how peaceful the morning is. That peace did not come from forgetting Voldemort. It came from defeating him, from learning, from choosing better, from believing, finally, that the future belongs not to those who try to control it through terror, but to those who build it with courage and care.